We're starting a new theme this week. The theme really began last week when our youth group gave their truly spectacular worship service. It's funny, we had Youth Sunday planned for a different date, but we had to move it, and so the date that they were on last week is just sort of where it landed. And I said, I was supposed to be preaching about snails that day. Do you think the youth group would want to do a service about snails? Maybe we can see if they're interested. And what they put together is truly amazing. If you haven't seen that service, I can't recommend it enough. So the theme this month is all things wise and wonderful. And we're going to be talking about creatures and organisms that we often overlook. I first thought of this series when I learned the term Charismatic Megafauna. If we were in the sanctuary full of people right now, I would say, everybody say Charismatic Megafauna. Say that in your living rooms or wherever you're watching this. Hey, Chris, say Charismatic Megafauna.
Charismatic Megafauna.
Right. Charismatic Megafauna is an environmentalist term, and it refers to animals that are instantly recognizable and that people are interested in preserving, right? And therefore they make really good mascots for conservation efforts, right? Charismatic meaning people like it, and megafauna meaning, mega is big, fauna is animal. So this is, the Bengal tiger, or the giant panda, or the humpback whale, right? Animals that you see sort of as right in front in the environmentalist conservation efforts. But using these animals, I understand, is controversial, right? The people who do it say, anything that gets people excited about taking better care of our planet can't possibly be bad. But there are other voices in the environmentalist movement that say, most endangered species aren't as charismatic, right? They don't make good stuffed animals, but they are no less important to the preservation of ecosystems. And so if we only focus on the animals that people like, then we lose sight of what we're trying to work towards. And I think, I'm not in any way qualified to be part of that conversation, but I think it's interesting, and I think there's a spiritual component to this argument as well, right? When we think about our connections to the earth, when we think about our spiritual home in the earth, and we think about our connections to animals as part of our creation, and what animals do we value, right? Like when you have a picture of Noah's Ark for the kid, what's Noah loading onto the ark? He's got tigers, he's got pandas, he's got giraffes, he's got, things that we like to look at. We don't really show Noah rescuing a pair of snails. But surely snails are not any less important, right? They're not any less worth saving than any other species. And snails, as our youth taught us last week, have just as much to teach us as anything else on our planet. And so that's what we're going to be looking at this month. We're going to be spending our time with 4 organisms that we might otherwise be tempted to overlook. And we're going to try to see what lessons they can teach us about our lives as spiritual people. And we're going to be framing this very roughly from the creation narrative in the book of Genesis, right? With the understanding, we're going to be skipping the parts of the Genesis creation narrative that are all about creating the sky and stars and planets, because we did that series like a month ago, and you all deserve a break. So in the creation narrative at the beginning of the book of Genesis, the first physical part of the world that God creates is dry land that is separate from the water. Interestingly, the book describes water as already having been there before the world is created, it's interesting, but that is an exegetical nut that we are going to crack another time. So the story says that before anything else, God creates dry land, and then on the same day, on the dry land, God creates the plants. Right? So on that day, we just have plants, and the book doesn't say which plants come first. But scientifically speaking, the first plants on our planet were mosses. There has been moss on our planet for 470 million years, making moss one of the most successful organisms that we know of. And a big part of moss's success comes from the fact that it is very simply constructed, right? And it requires relatively little nutrients and resources to thrive, and thus it can survive in many different environments. Moss, in some ways, is the baseline for all living things. It set the tone from which all of the rest of the reality that we know has sprung. And what's interesting is that moss is also a reality in and of itself. Within patches of moss, there are entire ecosystems. There are species, there are water cycles whose entire microscopic existence happens within a patch of moss. When we examine moss under a magnifying glass, it shows itself to be intricate and beautiful, with leaves and shoots and branches finely woven together, with creatures and water and other plants moving through them and living inside of them. Moss is a vessel for the magnificent, contained within the seemingly mundane. And so this lesson that moss teaches us is similar to a lesson that I learned in a receiving line in the summer of 2014. I had just preached my first sermon at the congregation where I did my internship, First Church in Boston. And I was feeling pretty good about it. I hadn't passed out from nervousness, and the congregation had laughed when I wanted them to laugh, and nodded when I wanted them to nod. And I was standing there in the receiving line and shaking everybody's hands in the way you could do before COVID. And then this guy came through the line, and his name was Leo. And Leo had been the congregation's music director for many decades before he retired many decades ago. And so Leo shook my hand and smiled, and he introduced himself, and then he said, "One or two jokes is fine, but you're making too many. You're telling jokes in your sermons because you want us to like you, and that's an understandable thing to want, but it's drawing attention away from your message, and you don't need it. Your message is enough." And then he walked away. And this is what Leo did. Every time I preached, he would come through the receiving line, and he would just give me feedback that was insightful, and it was well thought out, and it was phrased in a way that was always really kind, but really direct. And it was something that I came to value. Just as a side note, this is not an invitation for all of you to start doing that in the receiving line when we someday get to start doing the receiving line again. Like, I am still more than happy to just smile and shake your hand. But I did come to really value these moments with Leo, and it was something that I thought I was going to miss when I moved to Memphis. But when I moved here, I met Bob Deininger, who was a long-time beloved member of our congregation, and Bob would do something similar. In the receiving line, Bob was much gentler with his feedback than Leo ever was. But I've been thinking about Bob and Leo recently, and about this first lesson that Leo taught me about prioritizing spiritual truths over making people like me. And, for the past year plus, I've had to preach without any of that, without making anybody laugh, right? I've had to enter a worship space in a way that cannot rely on my razzle-dazzle. And that's new for me, right? I think as Americans, we are taught to want things that are big and flashy and exciting, right? In all parts of our lives, including our religious lives. And this is why so many mega churches have these, big light displays and rock bands and LCD screens, right? We just have this idea that more is always better. And before this pandemic started, I was inching dangerously close to that mindset, right? I was focusing a lot of my energy on trying to make the worship services at the Church of the River bigger in every way. I was planning to add a second service on Sunday mornings. I wanted to hire a live band for the second service. I was definitely focused on making sure that the pews were full in both the first and second service, and I wanted to take some time to work it all out in some kind of, very glamorous spiritual planning retreat that would look really good on Instagram in a way that would really help the church's brand. And then this pandemic happened, and all of that had to be set aside, right? I haven't completely lost interest in any of those things. But the pilgrimage that I have found myself on this year has been more of an internal pilgrimage. It's been a search for religious insight that happens in the rhythms of day-to-day life. And so often, that is where God can be met. That is where the sacred can be experienced every once in a great while. We may get a spiritual moment that comes with some fireworks, right? A moment of revelation or the birth of a child or something really intense, but mostly our connections with what exists beyond us come through building relationships with what is around us in our everyday lives. And in that way, the spiritual path that this pandemic has set us on is just like examining the worlds within a patch of moss. It's about realizing that every bit of the world we see around us has the divine woven into it, if only we are willing to look hard enough. And what's funny to me about this is, the COVID-19 pandemic is itself a big, bright, intrusive event, right? It has violently and suddenly invaded our lives and caused all of us real trauma. I have dealt with more loss and heartbreak this year in my own life and in the life of the congregation than in the rest of my career put together. But I am convinced that the way to live through this big, loud event is to embody the opposite. It is to excuse ourselves from the need for the big, exciting, and flashy, and to let ourselves find God or find whatever we experience as divine in the patches of moss that we see around us, in the tiny little miracles and wonders of our everyday lives. And that's something that I hope we can at least partially take with us when this pandemic finally ends. I like to say there is nothing good about this pandemic, but there can be good in the ways that we respond to it. And so what we have in front of us here is an opportunity to become less dependent on what is big and loud and new and more focused on finding love and truth in the lives that we have. And that, I think, is the advice that Leo was trying to give me when he told me that I didn't need to rely on my jokes in my preaching. He wasn't telling me that I'm not funny. I happen to know that I am hilarious. He was telling me that religious experiences don't need to be flashy and fresh. In fact, they usually aren't. God is not only present in our encounters with the charismatic megafauna of our spiritual world. God is present in our everyday lives, in our connections, and in what we see and whom we connect with. God is present in the mysteries and wonders that a person sees when you look close enough at something as everyday as a patch of moss. I want to tell you all this little story as an example to close with. This past week, my son Gideon turned 6 months old. And so that means that, the pediatrician says he can now eat solid food. So this past week, he got to eat real food for the first time. And we started him out with eggs, because ever since Sandra got pregnant, she had this untamable craving for eggs. So we thought, well, there's probably something in there that he wants. So we, cooked him up these eggs. Kind of, it's sort of, picture an empty omelet, right? Just kind of like a flat, thin thing that you cut into strips. And so we sat there in our dining room watching Gideon squealing with delight in his high chair and covering himself in eggs. He can get them to his face. It's in the mouth where he's not quite there. I think he managed to eat a few. So I was watching him, and as I was watching him, and Sanj and I were laughing at this, this ridiculous scene, Gideon going to town on the eggs, and the dog is running around at his feet and eating everything that he drops, which is most of it. And as I was watching this, and I thought about the time before the pandemic when I took so much pride in how busy I was. Now, I was out in the world doing big, important things. I was preaching big services. I was going to fancy galas. I was flying around the country to teach and to speak. And here I was now sitting at the table and watching this hilariously gruesome display happening in front of me. And I think before the pandemic, I might have missed it. I mean, I might have been physically present, but I don't know that I would have been paying attention in a way that let me feel the presence of God in that moment. I mean, there's nothing particularly special about a person eating eggs, even if they're eating them for the first time. In a certain sense, there's nothing really special about a person being born, right? Hundreds of thousands of people do it every single day. And still, I can tell you that I felt the presence of God in that moment, just like I felt the presence of God in the moment that Gideon was born. It was a presence that didn't explode in my face, but that worked its way into my life and settled under the surface of who I am. When I think about Leo from First Church Boston, and Bob Deininger from Church of the River, both of them now of blessed memory, and I try not to imagine the two of them looking down on me and critiquing my sermons together, because they were both humanists, and I don't think that that's what they would want. But I think about these two men, both of whom I met when I was in my 20s and they were in their 90s. And I do like to think that I have integrated who they were and who they still are to me into who I am. Like part of the ecosystem in a patch of moss that is my life and my outlook. The lessons that they taught me are now a part of my everyday life, and I have learned to see the sacred in the moments that I had with them, just like the moment when my son ate his first eggs, or in the moments when I get to examine a patch of moss. And this is why the book of Genesis begins with God creating moss. It begins with God creating countless tiny worlds within worlds, with the spirit of all that is good and sacred being enclosed in all of the tiny, overlooked parts of our world and of our lives. Amen.